this webinar is really intended to get you to rethink a variety of things. So I have a lot of information, but I'm going to pause at times to think, and some things I actually have for you to look at later. There's just too much I could present and keep it, under an hour for the presentation. So I want to actually look at what is Agile at a sense really about. And to me, it's about learning. We're uncovering better ways. And notice the tense is present tense. Yet in many ways, we're kind of like, oh, we uncovered it and now this is what Agile is. So I'm not sure I believe that the Agile Manifesto and what's limited there, it's a good start, but it's more of an ideal to be going to. And there are a lot of things we're not looking at now because we're looking at we're looking more at other things that we've done in the manifesto, but we want to look beyond that. So there's like sometimes looking under the lamppost, there's where the light is, but this is very important to see that Edgar Schein's comment, we do not think and talk about what we see what we're able to think and talk about. So I suggest we have to start looking at things in a different way, and this will open up things for us to do. And I have a few quotes here, and these aren't just to be, nice, kind of trite quotes. It's actually to reflect on the meaning of it. And Stephen Covey talks about the way we see the problem is the problem. In other words, our view limits how we see things, and we need to kind of break out of that. And we talk a lot about, oh, we got to think this, and then we'll start doing things like, oh, if we trust, somehow that'll work. But you actually have to work your way or act your way into a new way of thinking than just say, oh, I'm going to do this. It's working together that makes the difference. So the question is, how do we get where we can work together and then create the qualities we want? I mean, if we can just create them right up front, that's great, but often you can't. I remember a time, one of the first Scrum gatherings before it was big, there were like, I don't know, 30 of us, maybe 50 of us. And everybody was talking about we needed to get customers to trust us. And I was thinking, no, we need to act in a way that gets customers to trust us. And that's kind of what I'm talking about here. There's also, Agile's got to be big business now. So there's a lot of things that people won't understand, not consciously trying to defend themselves from it, but when your salary is dependent upon it, it's hard to change. So there's a lot of things that people say, oh, we could just do this. And it's like, well, maybe. It ignores the reality of that we're dependent on a lot of these ideas. That just adds to the kind of defensiveness, nonsense even. And I love this quote from Arthur Schopenhauer. The task is not so much to see what no one has seen yet, but to think what nobody has thought yet about that which everybody sees. And what I mean by this in particular here is virtually everything I say, a lot of it might be new, but you should be able to understand from your own past experience. So I'm not asking you to believe in me. In fact, please don't. I joke, but it's true. I actually say people should never trust a consultant. But what I mean by that is don't distrust their motivations. There are a lot of really honest. I think most are well-intended and really trying to do a good job. I mean, don't trust what they say. Don't trust what I say. You have a lot of experience yourself, and everything I say, you should be able to reflect your experience to what I'm saying and then see if it's right or wrong. And those would be things, if you disagree, I please do ask you to ask a question at the end. Those are where the great conversations tend to come from. So please do that. Okay. So since I said the Agile Manifesto is about learning, let's first talk about learning a little bit. Let's talk about different mechanisms. And a lot of people know about double loop learning, but a lot of people don't. I admit I didn't learn about double loop learning until about, I guess, 12 years ago, but that was 40 years into my career. And so it took me a long time before I was introduced to it. So single loop learning, if we look at what we have assumptions, like maybe, assumptions here are theory. This is what we're basing our approach on. And then we do something, and then we get some results, and then we kind of inspect and adapt, you might say, if you're doing Scrum is a common way. That's single loop learning. We're learning how to do better. And double loop learning, though, is going back and checking our assumptions. Well, gee, I thought this would happen and it didn't. So what's wrong about the this that I was thinking of? So double loop learning is challenging the what you're doing. Double loop learning is kind of actually allowed in Scrum as long as you don't change the Scrum framework. So frameworks sometimes have well, you got to do this. You have to have cross-functional teams. Or in SAFe, there are certain things you have to do. So this is one thing already about frameworks. There's a certain degree of immutability in them. And although you can do double loop learning on some things here, you can't do double loop learning on the framework itself. And this is important because what we want to recognize is there's a difference between when we do learning in just I don't have a model, and learning where I do. See, if I don't have a model, I can do something, practice it, get the results, and do single loop learning. How do I get better? I can even do double loop learning, and maybe there's a better way to do this as long as I'm within the confines of the framework. But in Lean, one of the learning processes is plan, do, study, and adjust. And the adjust is get better at what I'm doing and maybe challenge, not maybe, definitely challenge the assumptions I'm making. So we want to do double loop learning as well as single loop learning. But there's even more. And I'll admit I didn't get really a deep understanding of this until, just recently when I really started studying, well, what's triple loop learning? Because I've heard that talked about a certain amount. So triple loop learning is about learning to learn. It's actually about getting better on doing double loop learning. So in a sense, double loop learning is getting better about how to do single loop learning by challenging our assumptions, and triple loop learning is how do we challenge our assumptions better. And here's a little synopsis of it that I like. Single loop learning gets us better at what we do and forces our habits because we better do the same thing. Double loop learning has us question our assumptions to make new habits. Triple loop learning has us learn how to question our assumptions faster. Okay. So I want to, again, this is learning. So this is the background. So now I'm going to talk about the topic, frameworks, pattern languages. But I wanted to make it clear that I'm actually trying to challenge a lot of assumptions we have. If you pay attention to the conversations on LinkedIn and Twitter and any social media, what you'll notice is there's almost a presumption that everything is a framework. When somebody says, well, this framework, and then they talk about another framework, there's not this presumption that there are other things than frameworks. And they're popular. They're easy to create, easy to use, easy to start with. They're well promoted, Scrum and SAFe in particular. There are others like Bless and Kanban are also frameworks. Okay, but not everything is a framework. Disciplined Agile isn't a framework. Tame Flow, my own approach, Amplio, Lean, theory of constraints. I would say the theories of flow as espoused by Don Reinertson in his book, Principles of Product Development Flow, Second Generation Lean Product Development, he's not proposing a framework. So there are non-framework approaches. And all the ones I know of actually build off what I would call first principles that I'll talk with. In other words, they're not saying, oh, this is what we do. Rather, they're trying to get to a science of what's going on. And that's new for a lot of people. And at first, it looks kind of overwhelming, which is why I think people like frameworks, because the advantage of frameworks, and they have advantages. You can get a quick start with a framework. They can be well defined. There are a limited number of things to know because they say, hey, here's what it is. And this is good. These are nice things. You want to be able to start quickly. You want to understand what it is, and you want it to have a limited amount of things you need to get started. And this is why frameworks are attractive to a lot of people. Okay. But there are challenges with them. And I don't think they're inherent to frameworks, but I don't think they're inherent to what we're trying to do. So I want to look at them. Remember our assumptions? They're difficult to change. Frameworks by their very nature are this way. And as they grow over time, they get complicated. A lot of people talk about how SAFe gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more complicated because they just keep adding stuff to it. Okay. But one of the insidious problems is people focus on the framework instead of the real problem. Now, presumably, this is one of the assumptions, that if you focus on the framework, you'll solve your problems, or the framework gives you a way to solve your problems. But that's just a presumption. I prefer to work straight on the problems. Now, I could say, well, that's a little hard, Al. That's complicated. Okay, well, I understand the rationale for it. But the better thing is to create, instead of thinking, you tend to follow frameworks. In fact, you hear this all the time. Oh, we need to follow this until you understand. Shu Ha Ri is a metaphor I actually dislike. Shu is following. Ha is you get some facility yourself in re as you go beyond it, but there's nothing about how to go from shu to ha or ha to re in the framework itself. And why would you follow something at the front? Well, a lot of people like following things, so I can understand that. But a lot of people would rather solve their problems given the right tools. So it's kind of like maybe the difference between painting in the box art or becoming a master artist. Is it really that hard? Well, being a master artist maybe, but can you paint on your own for your situation? I would claim frameworks aren't the best for that. Okay. So there are other issues. Scrum actually doesn't that a lot. So it focuses on simplicity, but I think it's made it simplistic. It's mostly unchanged in 20 years. It's left out a lot of stuff that's learned. SAFe, of course, keeps trying to be complete, so it's made itself more complicated. This is the rigidity of frameworks manifesting itself. They're not particularly flexible. Scrum even claims not to be immutable, and SAFe does have some flexibility, and you don't have to start with the whole thing. You could start at the team level, what they call essential SAFe, and move forward. But in any event, it's not easy to plug and play practices. So you got this framework, and maybe you want to, it would work better to do this here. Usually there's no method given to figure out what that is. And then again, even if there is, it's like you're not allowed in Scrum and still be doing Scrum. And in SAFe, the question is, well, if I change this, how does it affect everything else? So it's kind of risky to make changes, even if you think you understand. So this is my kind of issues, I guess I could say, with this. Well, how did we get here? Okay. Well, the rationale for using a framework existed when we didn't understand first principles or inherent simplicity. I'll talk about both of these in a few minutes. Basically, in a nutshell, it's how things work and how we can look at a complex problem. Back in I got into kind of the Agile space, if you want to call it that, in '99, when there were people talking about it, and I was in that crew. I didn't go to the Agile Manifesto Snowbird one in 2001, but I was invited to the 2011, the 10-year anniversary. We called it Snowbird 10. But back in '99 to 2001, there's a whole crew of us. What is this thing we're doing? We didn't really know what to call it. So when Agile came out, it was like, oh, at least we got a name for it. There were some things about the manifesto I actually didn't agree with, or I thought left out. It doesn't have systems thinking in it, and it's focused on the team. That's why it's been expanding to include systems thinking, be holistic, and look at the whole organization. But what's in the manifesto and where we are today is actually a disparity, I think. But anyway, the rationale was back then we didn't know lean flow and the theory of constraints as it related to software development and further into knowledge work. So frameworks made sense. Hey, this is an easy way to start. I was a big proponent of Scrum at the beginning. I was on the early rise of Kanban. David Anderson and I formed Lean Kanban University, now called Kanban University. I brought the Lean, he brought the Kanban, I left, so it's just Kanban University now. We set up the Kanban conferences. And as we learned how to do Lean and Kanban and theory of constraints inside the software development arena and inside knowledge work, it's gotten to be there are other opportunities. So the question is, now we do know this. What do? We don't need these cages, the limitations to get us started, okay? And there are people who will tell you have to, and I'm telling you, no, you don't. And I'm not alone in this. There are a lot of people, Tom Gill, Don Reinertson, Steve Tendon with TameFlow, and Ellie Goldratt would agree with it too, except he said it in his past work. So the problem is frameworks. I think the problem is even worse with frameworks. They're about information and about following, and training has become about information and about certification. And I think this is a serious problem. I'm not going to go into it, but you probably heard about the Agile Industrial Complex. I think they all go together. It's not a coincidence the two most popular Agile methods are frameworks, and the most training is done this way, and yet it's not really done in a good way. And that's time for another talk, perhaps. I want to do how to think. Okay. And it doesn't mean everybody on the team needs to think. Seriously, I know that sounds a little weird. Some people, like coders, sometimes say, let me work for let's just build stuff for the customer. That's what I want to do. So then the Agile coach at least should be thinking about this and seeing what to do. Now let's just step back a little bit. and look at Agile versus frameworks. Agile is about these qualities. You know, it's an open, in a sense, environment. Frameworks are kind of these qualities. And it's kind of a closed system. When you just stop and think about this, it might start reflecting something's off here. And that's what I'm saying. Something is off here, and it's causing a problem. And we have the same problems. You hear about people doing SAFe over and over and over again, trying it again and again and again. And I hear the same thing with Scrum. Why is that? You know, and we need to look at this. You know, the famous doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results as insanity. Although I joke, I don't care what that says. I still want another cup of coffee a lot of the times. I've been drinking defective coffee my whole life. After a couple hours, it seems to wear off, but I still want another cup. Anyway, a little humor. So what do? We need a better way. Okay. And this is one of my favorite quotes by Buckminster Fuller. He's the one who came up with the term spaceship Earth. He's just brilliant, passed away a few years ago, but he's brilliant. And I love this quote about him, where I'm going to suggest frameworks are like piano tops in this quote, where he says, I'm enthusiastic over humanity's extraordinary and sometimes very timely ingenuity. If you're in a shipwreck and all the boats are gone, a piano top buoyant enough to keep you afloat that comes along and makes a fortuitous life preserver. But this is not to say the best way to design a life preserver is in the form of a piano top. I think we are clinging to a great many piano tops and accepting yesterday's fortuitous contrivings is constituting the only means for solving a given problem. Oh, so what's the problem? What are the requirements? Let's step back and look at what's going on and get the requirements for what we're trying to do. Okay, well, I think we need a flexible structure. I think we need a way to plug and play our roles, events, artifacts, and rules. Really allow anything that's useful. We don't want to be constrictive. We want to provide guidance, though, to make choices. I think this is what we're talking about. Now, framework does some of these, but it doesn't do all of them. So is there another approach? That's what I'm questioning. And I'm about, you might guess, hey, I think he's going to talk about pattern languages. And the answer is, yeah, but also what is a pattern language? I'm not expecting anybody here understands patterns or pattern languages, but I'm sure some people do. So let's look at languages. Okay, before I get into what a pattern language is, let's just look at languages. They're flexible. They have rules, but they can convey what you need to. You know, they can grow and adapt. That's an interesting aspect. You know, so what if we had a language of the concepts that helped us create value for our stakeholders? What if we had a way to talk about them? What would the words, I should put that in quotes perhaps, of such a language look like? This is what I'm asking and about to present. So words in this language need to have a name so I can talk about them. They have to have an objective. You could say a meaning, but in our case, we're using this language to do something or help us do something. So what's the objective of the language? What are the issues they deal with? And we need different implementations for different situations because we know there are no universal practices. There's nothing, well, there are a couple of minor ones that are actually pretty important, but I'm not going to go into those. But more or less, most of the things have to be contextual for what you're doing. Okay. So I'm saying the words we want in our language, I'm going to call them patterns. Patterns is defined as a solution to a recurring problem in a context. This is by Chris Alexander. It comes from Timeless Way of Building. I'll get to that in a second. Patterns have options for implementation. So it's a solution, but it gives you different ways of implementing the solution. You know, like a car could be a pattern. There's electric cars and there are gasoline cars, diesel cars, things like that. Okay. Implementations depend upon the specific forces present. By force, I mean the issues, so to speak, how things resolve themselves. There are different ways you can implement a pattern with different strengths and weaknesses, and you pick the one that's best for the context you're in. And each would apply to a different situation better than others. Again, this comes from Timeless Way of Building. I highly recommend reading this book. In fact, it's my #1 book recommendation of all the books I've read. I don't know. I was reading a lot in high school, so a lot of books, you know, 55 years or so of reading. And this is a book that's good for whether you're technical or non-technical. This has nothing to do with the product development, by the way. It has nothing to do with software. It has nothing to do with Agile in a sense. It's really a way of thinking of problems and what design is. And it's a fun book to read. My wife read it. Okay, no, I've been married to my wife for like 35 years, and we were known as the high-tech, high-touch company, a couple. You know, you could guess who the high-tech guy is. And she was an ex-massage. Well, now she's an ex-massage therapist. She was a school counselor. And we've actually grown a lot similar, although I joke she's made me a better person and I've made her a smart ass. But I appreciate that, so it's not a problem. But she read this book, oh, I don't know, like it was like 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And she loved it. And I had her read it because it was about building, you know, building towns, building houses. It had you rethink your problems differently. And that's what's so powerful about this book, is it comes to you with a way to think about how things relate to differently. And if you're in any kind of product development, you'll see how to look at systems differently. Now, a lot of people recommend the pattern language. This is a brilliant book. And this is an example of the timeless way of building. But the timeless way of building is what I recommend. And I'll give a recommendation on how to read it as well. He has about 20% of the book italicized. And he suggests, if you don't have time to read the whole thing, just read the italics. I suggest read the italics first anyway, even if you have time. That'll give you the overall concept. And then you can go through and read the book at the pace that works. Anyway, love this book. It's definitely worth the $50 it costs. Okay, patterns, though, are just the beginning. Okay, everybody talks about patterns, solutions to recurring problems in a context. But actually, this is actually the weakest part of his whole philosophy. It's not just the patterns. Patterns are like an essential aspect of it, like words in a dictionary in a sense. What's more important is we've got to go deeper. And on the book, 4 pages from the end, he says at this final stage, the patterns are no longer important. I remember when I read that, I knew it, but I joke in my design patterns classes. I said, why did you tell me this on page 2? I mean, why did I read all this and you telling me they're not important? But you know that the patterns have taught you to be receptive to what's real. So it's not a surprise. Patterns are examples of things, and there's a thought process underneath them. You know, there's no surprise. The real issues are the relationships between things, and that's important. Okay. Now, I want to delve deep into one pattern. I'm just picking this as an example because the courtyard pattern is where I kind of got it personally. Okay. And I want to read through this because everybody knows what a courtyard is. So let's take a few minutes, but you'll get the idea of what I'm talking about, and that's important. So he's talking about a courtyard pattern, a solution to a recurring problem in a context. So he's talking about properly formed things, helps people come to life in it. That's like, if you're doing architecture, you want people to have a place where they like being. So consider the forces at work in a courtyard. Most fundamental of all, people seek some kind of private outdoor space where they can sit under the sky, see the stars, enjoy the sun, perhaps plant flowers. This is obviously, those are some of the issues. But there are more subtle forces you may not think about. For instance, when a courtyard is too tightly enclosed, has no view out, people feel uncomfortable and tend to stay away. They need to see out into some larger, more distant space. You know, people are also creatures of habit. So if they pass in and out of the courtyard every day in the course of their normal lives, the courtyard becomes familiar, a natural place to go, and it is used. But a courtyard with only one way in, a place you only go when you want to go there, is an unfamiliar place, tends to stay unused. People go more often to places which are familiar. Now, the reason this pattern has a certain dear to me is that I remember when I was reading the book and I was thinking about a courtyard. And I was thinking about, I was in Boston, in Cambridge, going to MIT graduate school at the time. And I remember thinking, not when I was reading it, rather, I was thinking of the time I was in Cambridge. And I remembered this beautiful courtyard that I walked through once. And, oh my God, this was such an amazing thing. And it didn't have all these characteristics. It was like enclosed on almost 4 sides. There was one place in, and I remember sometimes walking out of my normal way and I saw this and wow, this is so beautiful. It's just amazing. There were flowers on all the walls, you know, and the windows. And I remember thinking, that's a courtyard and that doesn't fit this. But then I thought about it. I remembered that as I walked to campus, a lot of the times I would say, oh my goodness, I should have walked by that courtyard. He was right. People are creatures of habit. I wasn't going through the normal paths. I saw that courtyard once. I kind of know where it is. I still remember where it was relative to the house I was running. But he was absolutely right. It wasn't a very good courtyard for me. It was a good courtyard for whoever lived in that complex. So again, courtyards, you may implement them differently depending on where they are. See, and then there's even more subtle forces. There's a certain abruptness stepping out of the courtyard from the inside directly to the outside, not stepping into the courtyard. It's subtle enough to inhibit you. So they have in transitional spaces, porches, verandas, undercover, open to the air. It's psychologically halfway between indoors and outdoors. It makes it much easier, more simple to take each of the smaller steps that brings you out into the courtyard. So when a courtyard has a view out of a larger space, has crossing paths from different rooms, has a veranda or porch, these forces can resolve themselves. The view out makes it comfortable. The crossing paths help generate a sense of habit there. The porch makes it easier to go out more often, and gradually the courtyard becomes a pleasant, customary place to be. Now, there are a few interesting things here I want to point out before I go. First of all, I didn't know there were all these things in a courtyard. So it's nice he mentions them. But what's perhaps more important to notice, I can start with the simple things, the obvious things, then delve deeper, and then go even deeper. So it's not like you need to know everything about a courtyard. And in fact, if you're not going to build a courtyard yet, don't worry about it. You can get to it when you need to, but it's a pattern that has all this information. Now, there's another thing about this. See, he brings in other patterns, verandas, porches. So he's actually brought in that we have courtyard patterns, we have veranda patterns, porch patterns, and these all fit together. He's talked about how things work in a context. So this is important to notice. Patterns are kind of very rich, different options, different issues. Yet we can say courtyard. And with just that, somebody who's an expert brings up a lot of things. Someone who's not an expert, fewer things, but they understand what you're talking about. This is very powerful. This brings up the concept that we don't need to have the same amount of information all the time to people. Okay, so now I'm suggesting the language should be about patterns, a set of patterns that help us manifest what we're trying to do, create value for our stakeholders quickly in an effective manner. And that's what I mean by pattern language. And I'm presuming, a pattern language for knowledge work. It's not a language for everything. If you try to make a language for everything, I don't know it'd be that effective. Okay, so patterns in knowledge work are example of patterns, how to make the general level of work to be done by the team. It could be a pattern for the entire organization. In fact, Amplio, my approach, has almost like two languages in a sense, one for the team level, one for the whole organization. The two are compatible and overlap, a lot of similar words. So an example, forces about how much work, what's the composition of the team, focus on what's of value, availability of people who understand the problems you solve. These are all different concepts. Again, in my scale, agile, not scaled, but agile at scale language I use, it's about 36 words or patterns, and about 25 or so for at the team. And they overlap. There's actually some similar in both languages. So to use a pattern language in knowledge work, we must understand the nature of knowledge work, because that's going to enable us to focus on it instead of trying to make a general purpose for anything. I'm not trying to solve all problems. This talk is about working in knowledge work, which is basically an expanded view of Agile, perhaps. We're not just interested in software development. We're interested in creating value. It could be a product, could be a project, could be a service, could be maintenance, could be any number of those things. It's where there's more time spent thinking about things, and people doing the work know better than their managers typically. That's knowledge work, using Drucker's definition of knowledge work. Okay. So to use a pattern language in knowledge work, we must understand it's created a system. It's a considerable amount of uncertainty. We must attend to what a system is. A lot of times we're not doing systems thinking. The Agile Manifesto did not have a lot of systems thinking in it. In fact, even the people over process, there's an interaction between people and process. It's not one over the other. But that was in reaction to, at the time, process was running people. So I understand why they overstated it, but it didn't reflect how do people and process interact with each other. Don Reinertson likes to say people times process. Both are multiplicative effects. How do we manage complexity? Okay. So I'm going to need to step back now about how do we talk about systems thinking. So there are three things that work together. This is Russ Akoff. He's one of my heroes of systems thinking. And he talks about systems are not its collection of parts. You know, he talks about you could take the best cars, take the best parts of the best cars, put them together, and what do you have? A pile of junk. You do not have cars. Carness, as he said, I love that phrase, carness. It's defined by the relationships between the parts. How does the engine work with the transmission? Assuming you have a transmission. If you've got a gasoline engine, you might need a transmission. If you've got electric motors, you may not. In fact, they don't have transmissions. They just run the motors at different ways. So it's, again, the way parts are going with each other. Systems are complex as these relationships are complex. They take the human body, for example, your heart. It's affected by most everything else in the body. It's complex. You can't quite see what to do. Now, there are some general rules, cholesterol and different things like that, but it's complex. It's not just complicated. You can't really understand all the things that are going on. So systems thinking includes complexity by saying some of the relationships are not understandable because they're so interrelated with each other and they're so subtle, you can't possibly figure them out. So systems thinking has complexity embedded in it. So what do we do with this? How do we look at this? Well, it's an issue. It's kind of difficult. How do we decompose things? This is basic. How do we decompose while identifying these relationships? Okay, well, this is an issue because you can't just take the pieces. Remember, it's the relationships between the pieces. If you say, I got an engine and I got a transmission and I got the wheels, and then you change the engine from gasoline to electric without hybrid, without another gasoline engine, you don't need that transmission anymore. So things, you change one, it affects other things, okay? Well, this is where Alexander again comes in, and this is the real power of his work in my mind. That pattern languages define not only how the patterns relate to each other and provide us with required behavior, it does this while maintaining the bigger picture in the whole. Now, there's a lot I can talk about here, but I'm not going to talk about all of it. But Alexander presents in the Timeless Way of Building a way of looking at the whole, starting with the whole, and then you decompose it into its pieces. Like we had the courtyard, and then we had the things that relate to the courtyard. You can even talk about a university. There's a university, and we're going to build around the square. Those are big courtyards. And then we're going to put this building here, and this building here, and this building here. We're going to have verandas between the building and the courtyard. See, as he's decomposing it, he's adding details. But the details are always within the context of the system, the composition, and Alexander presents it. So I'm going to suggest what a pattern language does is not just give us the pieces, but it talks about how the pieces relate to each other and gives us a way of starting at the whole and breaking it down into the pieces. And that's very important. Now, it's still complicated, maybe even still complex, because some of these relationships are complex. So the question is, how do we look at the whole? And here's Ellie Goldratt. And another brilliant book, definitely one of my top 5. Everybody would think, oh, I'm going to say The Goal. No, The Goal is brilliant. But actually, I would say The Choice. Okay. And the reason is The Choice, and The Goal is great. Read them both. But the thing about The Choice, it's really about critical thinking. And it's about how do we look at complex problems. And he presents a different view that is very consistent with Russ Akoff's systems thinking and very consistent with Alexander's way of breaking things down. But he starts with saying this: the first and most profound obstacle is that people believe that reality is complex. By the way, remember, this guy's a physicist, so he knows what reality is. He's not some flat earther or something. And therefore, they are looking for sophisticated explanations for complicated solutions. And he says, do you know how devastating this is? Now, he goes more into this. Now, he knows the world is complex. He does know that. But if you look at it as if it's complex, as if you can't really understand it, you build these huge systems that are complex and not understandable, and it becomes overly complicated. Or you take the other approach and maybe just look at individual pieces and hope they come together. So what Goldratt claims is that if we dive deep enough, we'll find there are very few elements at the base, the root causes, which through cause and effect connections are governing the whole system. Now, I had been looking for this since around 2005. And the reason is I was at Net Objectives, I was CEO there, and I had some really brilliant consultants. And what I had noticed was that they did things differently, but I was wondering, but is there some similarity between what they're doing? Because they were all kind of pretty much my top 3 consultants that I can think of, and I thought they were better than me, every one of them, were all ex-managers, some even at the director level. And what they did is they looked at things from a business perspective, and they did different ways of doing it. In other words, they all looked at what's the next thing we could deliver quickest, for that has high value, but they had different ways of doing it. But the intention of it, the objective of it was the same: value efficiently, effectively, and the right thing, and discovering what it is all at the same time. So this is like kind of a pattern. Pattern is, how do you know what to build next? And there were different implementations, and they were all effective. And some of the differences here was how they did it. But what I also was paying attention to was, what are they looking at? Like, are we looking at big objects, small objects? Are we having our work visible or not visible? Do we, work? How are teams organized? Do we have the same kind of people working? And I started noticing that there were similarities in approach. There were a few things, like about a dozen things, that if I looked at, that I picked up from watching them. In other words, I didn't go off in there and say, oh, Al, let's come up with a great system. No, I looked at what worked for years. And I think it was in 2019, about the time the IP of Net Objectives was purchased, maybe a year before, I read The Choice. And in The Choice, he talked about this. What are these few things that work? And then he talked about what it is. He called this inherent simplicity. And it's the reality. Any part of reality is governed by very few elements, and that any existing conflict can be eliminated if we take that as a given, is absolutely correct in every situation. And if we do, we'll find ourselves thinking clearly. Now, let me give you a couple of these. Things like overloading work. Are your teams overloaded? Are they task switching? Is there micromanagement going? Is it clear what we're working on? Do we understand our stakeholders? These are all things that are out there that work, that govern us. And I'm not saying there is a small set that does everything 100%, but I've identified about 10 things that pretty much give us insights on this. Now, I'm going to show them too in a minute. Don't have a lot of time to go over them, but I just want you to see they're there, and then you could refer to them later. And I'll give you some resources on my website as well. The key that I'd been missing, and to be honest, I'm not sure why, because I noticed this in the design pattern work I'd done. In design patterns, we came up with a variety of qualities and realized they worked well together. What I'd been missing is this notion that in inherent simplicity, they're harmonic with each other. They're rather in harmony with each other. They all work together or work against each other. If you improve one, it tends to improve others of these factors. And then I got, I can use these. And since I work around value streams, I call them factors for effective value streams. And it's basically inherent simplicity applied to knowledge work. Okay, so talking about relationships, let's get a little bit more defined with them, because a lot of people talk about, well, complexity, you can't do what I'm talking about. And I've heard this a lot. No, you can't do this, Al. Well, I've done it. So your theory and my theory may disagree, but I like looking at evidence. And not have I done it, I've seen other people do it, and I learned by watching other people how to do it. What I've done is refined it. In other words, I've looked at what's needed by watching what other people have done, not saying, oh, this is what you need to do. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not saying, oh, this is what you need to do because I'm so smart. I'm not saying that at all. I've watched smart people do things, and I've discerned what they do and how they react. And there are 5 relationship types. So instead of looking at, am I in complex, complicated, simple, or whatever, I'm saying I'm always in complex. If I'm in knowledge work, I'm in complex. But in knowledge work, the relationships that are present are like simple. I do this, that happens, I know that, or complicated. Several things are working together. Or complex, I can't figure out what's going on. It's too obtuse, too involved. There's also coupled. In other words, if I do this, it's going to affect that in a way that I may or may not understand. So it could be coupled things are complex. If I do one thing here, it's going to affect something there. And then potentially nonlinear, like the straw that broke the camel's back. The idea that a little change could make a big difference. Chaos. This is a chaotic event, not the state chaos, but what's called a chaotic or non-linear event, when some little thing happens. Like relatively speaking, the Titanic glancing an iceberg, it's not a big thing. People didn't really think it would cause any real damage, but it did. It sunk the ship. There are all sorts of things. The O-rings on the Challenger. Little thing like, oh, I'm using metrics, I'm using feet. Nobody notices it. Big difference. In software development, product development, we see all the time this happens. We have a schedule, especially if you're micromanaging. We have a schedule. Somebody's sick that day. We didn't get a piece of information. It cascades, causes problems. This is really big. So applying inherent simplicity to knowledge work has to attend to things like creating value for the stakeholders. I like designing it around the value stream because the value stream gives us a lot of insights. And I'm going to suggest if we take these two concepts, inherent simplicity can focus on these. What are the core factors? And what we need to do is we want to avoid waste while creating value. We want to focus on value. We want to create tight feedback loops. Remember, things are going to surprise us. Something's going to happen because we didn't see some relationship, and it might be nonlinear. I mean, a little change, big difference. So we need to dampen that by having quick feedback. Oh, we got a little error here. Okay. Also, we need to do things like decouple scheduling and stuff by using pull methods, things like this. Okay. Now, these next two slides are here for reference, and they're available on my website. And I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes going over these. But I do want to mention them. And I want to understand where I'm coming from. You don't necessarily need to agree with all these things. And in fact, I admit, I change these a little bit as my understanding gets a little better. But I call these the mindset first principles and guidance of Amplio. And I want to be very clear about this. I am using Amplio because that's my system, but I want to be very clear. I'm not proposing these as this is what you need to do. Rather, what I'm saying is I've been observing this for now 17 years. I really started doing this around 2005 when we started getting into multiple team things. Before then, it was easy enough to just do Scrum and XP and stuff. But once we started getting into multiple teams, it got more complicated, complex even. So I started looking. So these are things I've observed. These are things I would say I can show, I can demonstrate, and they're how Amplio gets defined. So the Amplio set is just what I've seen as best. And if you disagree, then that's great. Please let me know either later at the end when we have Q&A, or send me an email, because I'm always refining these. These aren't like my theories. These are like, a physicist saying, here's what I think's there. And then if you learn something new, you absorb it. I just call it Amplio because it's how I'm looking at it right now at the moment. Check back with me in 3 months and I'll bet you there'll be some minor improvements. It's an ongoing refinement of things. These are actually pretty stable, but because I've been looking at this for a long time. Just first of all, a mindset. What's the goal is? Stakeholders, internal, external. There's a belief we can understand what's going on, even in complex systems. Maybe not all of it. We'll still get some surprises. We have to attend to value streams. Systems thinking is important. And we must continuously question our methods. Now, I need a term. The term for first principles is not something I made up. This is their principles that basically stand on their own. They partially describe how the world works. They're not defined. Rather, they're discovered through observation. So these aren't Amplio's first principles that have been defined. These are what I, as the kind of creator of Amplio, have observed through conversations with a lot of other people, Don Reinertson, Steve Tendon, Lily Goldratt, lots of others. And these are ones I have talked about so I can give a language to it. And they're used to provide guidance as to what we should do. And here are some of them. We can complete smaller items faster than larger items. Just ask yourself, does that make sense? Local improvements don't necessarily result in global improvements. We can't manage what we don't see. Delays in workflow and getting feedback and taking advantage of lessons learned cause waste. See, we talk a lot about eliminating waste. I want to stop causing it. A lot of the work we do, we cause ourselves. We'll only see what we think and talk about. People working beyond capacity causes delays that create additional work. Handoffs cause a loss of knowledge and information. People doing the work have more insights into how it should be done than those managing them. So I'm saying quick feedback. Innovate by attending to the customer journey. That is how the customer gets their job done. Attend to the quality of the product. That's a little extra guidance. See, I think these are truisms. Now, if you disagree, we should have a conversation. Maybe we don't have time now, but we have some at the Q&A. But I didn't make these up. I observed these. So from this, I came up with what I call factors for effective value streams. In other words, if you do these things, things get better. Obviously, they're very consistent with the first principles. Look for value quickly. Is work visible? Remember, you can't manage it if we can't see it. Avoid overloading people, because we already said that's a bad thing. So you can think of these. I'll just let you read these as I'm going to talk about it generally. The factors for effective value streams say, look, given our set of first principles, these are things you ought to do, because if you do these things, things will get better. You know, and then you also have even the management part, or leaders, management teams. Are they motivated? You got to be improving this. Okay, so this all sounds great. There's a big problem, however. And I acknowledge this, or I look at it because I think I've got it covered. But, well, that's maybe an assumption, but I don't think so. Again, I want you to look at it yourself. See, here I'm talking about stuff we can control. Here I'm talking about, oh, I see what to do. Oh, I see how we have to change it. I can work with the team to do this. We can work together to do it. But what about what we can't control? What about the outside world? What customers want and need? Because we're trying to discover that. We don't always know. Our own people in other parts of the organization, we don't know what they're going to do. If you stop and think about it, the best way to deal with these uncertainty is to be able to pivot quickly at low cost. How else are you going to do it? But see, if you do what I've been talking about, that gives you the ability to pivot. The feedback gives you quick pivoting. And the faster you pivot, the faster you pivot, the faster the feedback. One more try. The faster the feedback you get, the quicker the feedback you get, the faster you can pivot and the faster you'll go. Experience to me is not measured in months or years. It's measured in how many feedback cycles you've been in where you took advantage of what was there. You learned something. There's another thing about pivoting. It not just only lets you do better, it can be a competitive edge. Effective pivoting can provide us with anti-fragility. That's a weird word, anti-fragile. What's that? Okay, see, a lot of people talk about being robust. Robustness means maintaining our value in the face of change. Anti-fragility means getting more valuable in the face of change. This comes from this book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. I think he also wrote Black Swan, so I'm not certain of that, but this is a very good book. And he brings up an issue that I had not even thought about until I read it. I mean, it never crossed my mind that I can be stronger when things are changing. Now think about this, with the COVID having happened in the last few years. Those companies that could shift from in-store purchases to online purchases, they had a competitive edge if they could make that pivot. In fact, you saw a lot of that. Amazon went really big for a while. Now they're having some troubles. Other people have learned how to do it. DoorDash, things like that. There were companies that could deal with this massive black swan event called COVID, and they got stronger out of it. So this is a big potential thing to look at. Okay, so now let's step back and let's see how frameworks work. They had advantages, and let's look at the patterns. Remember, it started as a pattern language thing. I'm giving you all this background because I want you to see all the things that we can get into when we use pattern languages. And let's do the first step. Remember, we had advantages of frameworks: quick starts, well-defined, limited number of things to know. We want to make sure we can still do those. Okay, so at first, it looks like, oh, pattern language can't do this because it's this amorphous language, and what do we do? But I say at first. Okay, so how to use a pattern language to get the benefits frameworks provide? That's an interesting question. Well, how would we do that? Let's pick a few of the patterns that give us a start. We don't need to go with all of them. What are the essential ones? They're not all equally important. I might have a courtyard where we don't have houses around it. I don't need verandas. I don't need porches. Okay, I can also select reasonable, somewhat ubiquitous starting implementations. So years ago, I had this notion of Scrum as example. It was the idea that, hey, let's take Scrum and let's think about it as an example of things. In other words, time boxing is an example of how to do something. It's not the way to do something. It's just a way of doing something. So you could select those patterns in Scrum, actually, and say, okay, I'm going to take the patterns that are present in Scrum. I'm going to take the implementations that are in those patterns, and that gives me a quick start. Okay, good. That's cool. Well defined. Yeah, just these small set of patterns and the start. Yep, we got that. limited things to them. Yeah, I just got a few patterns and a few implementations. So I can actually I can take it if I'm already doing Scrum. I can say, okay, let's think about this pattern language. Let's think about this way of doing things, and let's look at where we are, and now say, oh, I can expand on it. I don't have to throw away anything I've done. This is true for SAFe, true for Scrum. I don't have to throw it away. I can build it from this. The question is now, how do I implement the language itself? Well, I have a number set of patterns. Again, like I mentioned, it's about 24 at the team and about 36 at scale. And basically they overlap to some extent. They follow the same factors for effective value streams. They follow the same first principles because those are scale free actually, but I can start at either level I want and I can grow one to the other, and they're consistent. So I can have a default implementation of the patterns, a defectus default. So I can do it this way depending upon where we are. Now, with a modest amount of inspection, we can adapt the language to the teams about to use it. Now, this is interesting. In other words, let's say I'm going to set up at the team level, and I could look, well, let's see. I've got a pattern that implements managing work in process, and one way of doing it is with flow, and another way of doing it is with time boxing, which way works better for me. So with a little bit of decision making, I can make it fit for purpose. Or I can look at it, well, cross-functional teams are awesome, but I can't get them here for a variety of good reasons. Well, maybe I'll figure out how to do a more flow or Kanban method. So we can tailor it. Okay. Now there's another piece to this. I've talked about 24 at the team, 36 at scale. Well, what if, but see, I'm not talking about what if you're doing hardware. I don't have those in there. What if you're doing FDA regulation or insurance, because I've worked in these fields and they have extra constraints. Well, even though I don't have them in my language, you can add them to the language. Well, what do I do when I deal with the FDA? What do I do? How do I deal with the FDA as a pattern? How do I deal with state insurance regulators? Easy. So you add that stuff, but you don't add it until you need it. I can also take things away as we add more and more to it, and we don't use some things. Just don't worry about those things. Only pay attention to what you need to. So we can add and remove patterns as needed, and it keeps it from getting too complex. Here's a little table. People love tables. So I put this there together. Just flexibility, tailorable, can substitute practices, can start small, can expand, just to give you some general comparison. Okay. Now, here's what's also cool. I've already actually answered this, how to use a framework as a pattern language. I've already told you how to do it with Scrum. But here's a general purpose way of thinking about it. Think of the framework as a set of Lego blocks. You know, you can implement a block with the same objective when you can substitute for it. In other words, if I see something and, well, it's not working here. See, I'm not just saying do like what Ken Schwaber calls Scrum, but I'm talking about saying that, you know, like Scrum Bud is like, well, we're doing Scrum, but we're not doing this in a way that makes it, we're not solving an impediment. I'm talking about substituting something where it works better. Remember, factors for effective value streams give you that. So that's a good thing to do. Okay. So we're guided by first principles, use the factors for effective value streams. Okay. Now, I'm essentially done. What I want to do is spend 2 minutes giving some background on where you can get more information, and then we'll do a Q&A that I'll let Susan monitor and all that. So first of all the stuff I'm talking about is in one of these 3 books. I want to explain what they are. Take a couple minutes. These are free. They're online. When I'm done with them all, the Amplio development's about 90% done. The Being a Professional Coach is maybe 95% done. We just decided to add some stuff to it. And the Amplio Scrum Guide is based on these 2. So it's not totally done. But let me explain what they are. You can get these just by going to successengineering.works, my website /books, or go to the site, go to resources, pick books. You'll see these 3 up here. I want to explain what they are. It's free resource. You don't even have to register to get it. It's totally free. I won't know you're there. Amplio development is the path to effective lean agile teams. This is my whole approach at the team level. It's kind of like essential SAFe in some ways. I am going to write an Amplio at scale. I know how to do it. Writing takes a lot of time. Now, as I was teaching, I have a workshop on Amplio development. I call the Amplio Development Masterclass. Another one starting in next month, actually. But as I was teaching the first version of it, people kept asking me, Al, but how do we convey this? And I realized that coaching was a critical piece. And at first I incorporated it into the Amplio development system. And then I realized, no, what I'm doing can be used by anybody. It's just, how do people know what's right and what's not right? What's the difference between an expert and somebody who's not expert? How do you convey things in pieces and all sorts of stuff? And I realized that this would work anywhere. It works really well for Amplio, but it can work anywhere. So I wrote it as a separate, it's short. The Amplio development book's only about 110 pages. Being a professional coach, only about 50, 60 pages. Although we include a little bit of Amplio development in there, the principles and stuff. Again, it's not Amplio, it's the way to look at first principles. So this is about 160 pages, about 100 pages, but half of it is just an excerpt from here that's process independent, but is these first principles factors for effective value streams. And then, as I said, you could wrap Scrum with this. So the Amplio Scrum Guide basically is about a, 5 to 10 page preface explaining what I'm doing. And then it has you read the principles here. And then it gives you the Scrum Guide. It says, hey, just look at the Scrum Guide, but within the context of here's how you change things. So it's about 10 pages plus 50 pages. And then the Scrum Guide, 13 pages. And of course, being a professional coach works well there as well. Okay, almost done. I got one more slide, then we go into questions. I have a lot of information available. You can always also send me an email, Shalloway at Success Engineering Works. There's a free community of practice. We meet every other week. Sometimes we use, sometimes I give away a collaboration board, a Miro board. You need the license to use it yourself. But, like Lean Coffee, how to do retros, things like that. We've got a few of them already in the hopper. already done. You could get just by registering, again, free. There's a development masterclass. This is basically my team level approach. If you're interested in SAFe, I used to be an SPC trainer. I was the first one outside of SAI. I know how to fix it, make it easier. It's not getting off of it. There's a lot of good stuff in SAFe, and there's a lot of not so good stuff in SAFe. People tend to just trash it, but there's some good thinking there. And if you're doing SAFe and having some problems or thinking about it, you might want to contact me. The DA Value Stream Consultant Workshop. One thing I do with these others is I train them over time. I like workplace learning, basically, not in a training. 2 days training, you lose almost all of it. This course, the Amplio Development Masterclass, actually is a 4-month program, the equivalent of a 2 or 3 day workshop, but it's done over 4 months so you can learn in your workplace. The DA, because it's basically the PMI's class and they have us do it over like 3 days or a few half days, we have a free 4-month after the fact. You get in and we talk about some advanced topics and give you an opportunity to learn. So I'm a real believer in after the fact ongoing training. It's the only way to go. Otherwise, you take a 2-day class, you need a coach, and that's expensive and time, and people don't have that. Blast is something I built, years before Nexus, but it's fairly similar to it. I think it's better, even though it predates it. I'm not saying they took it from me. I definitely didn't take it from them because I predated them by years, but it's where I use Lean and some Scrum implementations where they were having troubles. This is the other big thing. If anybody's listening who's responsible for internal training, this is something I'm setting up, is how can companies own their own training thing.
Al, we thank you so much for your time and for presenting with us.
Well, my pleasure.